Welcome to the second part of the module on governing forests as common property. The topic we will deal with in this particular video is governance of forests as commons. Now, when we're saying that forests are commons, as we've understood in the previous video, we have to understand how are they governed. Around the world, three types of institutions tend to be used to govern forests. We have state, which is government. You have private property, wherein people actually own forest land. And the third is by communities or indigenous people. When we're talking about governance of the forest by government, you're basically saying there are laws in place at either the state level or the central level, if we're taking an example from India. When we're saying private property, much of this does not exist in India, but in other parts of the world, tracts of forests are owned by individuals who then conserve it. The third is when the people themselves come together in order to actually govern the forest. We are interested, when we are looking at forests as common property, on how people themselves come together in order to govern the forest. However, you should understand that when we're talking about governance and institutions that govern, there are many intervening factors. To name a few: demography, development processes, change in landscape, and political alliances. What do we mean by demography? When the demographic shifts, that basically means when population shifts, when people migrate or out-migrate, in or out, it basically changes the way in which they look at the resource. When you live in a particular place for a long time, the resource tends to be a part of your customs, your rituals, but that does not hold true for people who come from outside. Another thing that tends to impact the way institutions operate on the ground are developmental processes. What incentives are there by government, by people themselves, in terms of the way they view development? Is it seen in terms of GDP growth? Is it seen in terms of sustainability? What incentives do governments give? How is that understood by people? When we talk about change in landscapes, landscapes themselves may change in terms of how land is used. Right? So if you have agricultural land, if you have construction, if you had large plantations like coffee or tea, the way land is used tends to affect the institution that governs the forest that occurs in this particular landscape. Political alliances obviously tells you that the incentives of the party in power will determine where forests as a commons are governed. So please understand, though we have three types of institutions, which institution operates and how local institutions themselves operate are determined by multiple variables, and I've just named a few. When we talk about evidence, right, from around the world, if you look at these three institutions, we find that 82% of the forests around the world are governed by the government, 11.9% by private holdings, and 8.3% by indigenous tenures. In the developing world, however, those forests that are governed by communities or by Adivasis are much higher. And this is an obvious difference that you may want to see. Then you would ask, if 82% of the forests are governed by the state, why would we be interested in looking at forests as commons and how they could be governed by the people themselves? This is because of research that is coming out from developing and underdeveloped countries that shows us that when government governs a forest, that particular feature that we spoke of in the previous module, the idea of hard to exclude, becomes very, very evident. The government is not very successful in actually keeping people out. The government is not able to ensure the sustainability of the forest. So what happens to the forest is it becomes open source. When something is an open source resource, it gets degraded very fast. This is where a particular theory comes in called the tragedy of the commons. When we talk of local people being involved in governing the forest, not only does it allow for sustainability of the forest, but it also challenges this theory of tragedy of the commons. The person who came out with the tragedy of the commons is a person called Hardin. He wrote this paper in 1968. Now, what did he say? Let me give you an example. Say there's a pasture land and there are 100 households around that pasture land. Each household has one cow. Now, each household grazes 100 cows on this particular pasture land. One person in this group gets a second cow. Now, suppose these people were living at subsistence level. When the person gets this second cow, what happens? Their income increases. Say they're able to send a child to school, or say they're able to eat 3 meals instead of 2. Hence, what would be the incentive for everybody else who has just 1 cow? Obviously, it would be to add 1 more. Each person would think, I'm only adding 1 cow. However, what happens to the pasture land? For the pasture land, which earlier supported 100 cows, when each person adds 1 more cow, it would mean there's a doubling of the use of that particular resource, which leads to its degradation, hence titled Tragedy of the Commons, meaning the tragedy for that particular resource. Hence, tragedy of the commons basically means that individual users acting independently according to their own self-interest behave contrary to the common good of all users by depleting or spoiling that resource through their collective action. This tragedy of the commons is something that forests face, mainly when they're used as open resource or when it's very hard to exclude people. Unfortunately, this has led to a very conventional response to the tragedy of the commons. They say, in order to prevent the tragedy of the commons, an easy solution is government. You bring in government rules, you bring in stringent laws, you bring in private property as well, meaning that people could own the forest and therefore you could exclude people. However, research does not support this claim. A challenge to the generalization of this conventional theory that to prevent the tragedy of the commons, you could have more stricter laws or more stricter rules is the research on common property. People who have studied commons and forests as commons have found evidence that when forests are governed by institutions like the state, they do not conversely lead to sustainability, but instead it actually leads to the degradation of that particular resource. Empirical studies have challenged the applicability of the conventional theory to forests by showing how forest users in many locations around the world have organized themselves vigorously to protect the forest and in many cases to actually enhance the forest. Ostrom, one person who we are quoting in this particular module, has studied resources from across the globe. She's not just studied resources of forests in the global south, that is in developing or underdeveloped countries. She's also studied resources in Europe, in Switzerland, in Portugal, in Spain, in Latin America, in Argentina, in Brazil, in the US, in Canada. She's also done a number of studies in India, Southeast Asia, Asia, and China. This gives us a solid body of evidence that shows that when people are allowed to participate in the governance of the resource, they are actually able to govern the resource more sustainably. Scholars familiar with the results of field research substantially agree on a set of variables that enhance the likelihood of users organizing themselves to avoid the social losses associated with open access and common pooled resource tragedies. Considerable consensus therefore exists that self-governance that follows certain rules, called as design principles, a particular theory that we will go through in the next part of this particular module, helps in managing common pool resources, leading to sustainable governance of forests as common pool resources. So let us recap. One, we've understood that different institutions are used to govern forests: government, private, and indigenous communities or communities themselves. Evidence from around the world shows us that often forests are governed by government, but unfortunately they face something called as the tragedy of the commons, wherein which resources or users in their own self-interest degrade the particular resource. Self-governance with evidence by many thinkers who work on commons, has proved to actually address this particular theory of the tragedy of the commons. In the next module, we will understand how people come together to self-organize, what are the principles that are required for such self-organization, and how does that then enable sustainable governance of the resource. Thank you.